back, everybody. I'm Tommy McCarthy, and this is Let's Talk Cyber. No stranger to Let's Talk Cyber now. He's almost part of the furniture. James Mullins, welcome back to Let's Talk Cyber.
Hey, Tommy, how are you?
Very good, James. Very envious of the fact that you've just back from a week's holiday. Well, holiday, what were those things again? I'll have to remind myself.
I know.
So, James, Vice President of Mattermost right across Asia and EMEA. So, very busy man, that's for sure. James, was delighted to spend time with you back in April at Cyber UK. And it's really because of what happened at Cyber UK, James. I want to talk a little bit more and expand on the whole out-of-band communication piece, because you hosted a tremendous, very successful workshop there, educating executives about the challenges when it all goes wrong, when the cyber attack happens. But I really do want to take a bit of time with you, if you don't mind, just to expand that whole concept around out-of-band, and none more so when a major cyber attack hits. What exactly does that out-of-band mean to the organization? Because we're looking at one, when it all goes wrong, your communications fail, but more importantly, what exactly does that mean to an organization? James, can we expand on that? Because you guys touched on it really well at the workshop, and I really want to get a better understanding for the challenges around that attack.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, thank you, Tommy. Very happy to expand on that. And as you know, at Cyber UK, it was a big theme, right? Everyone was really talking about how do you deal, when you have been attacked, because everyone will be at some stage. So I think the first thing to do is actually look at the attacker strategy. So most criminals, when they're going in, they're not just there to encrypt the data. They're actually going to make it challenging for you to actually work things out once that's been done. So what they'll actually do, they will target things that stop you from communicating. They will attack your kind of Active Directory. They'll go after Teams, Slack, or any other communication kind of network that you're using there. So really cutting off your ability to respond. And actually what we're seeing then is, because these things are actually happening, you're actually getting the IT teams then kicking in and actually doing essentially a self-inflicted blackout, right? Because as soon as they see something happen, they're trying to shut it down to stop that dissemination and that kind of infiltration of capability. So they pulled the plug to actually contain the breach. And then what you see is that kind of those isolation networks, they're all shutting down communications to try and stop that kind of further issue moving forward. So what we kind of look at, and what kind of, most organizations are actually now looking at, is that outer band kind of communications. And that's completely independent. It's pre-configured communication network that the event that something like this does happen, that you're actually kind of still staying active. So if you can imagine that your main company network is actually going dark, your outer band is keeping you in the bright. Okay, so you're still seeing, you can still communicate, and you can do things in that way. So if you've ever watched the films and you see those kind of secure red phones that you see kind of going on with people once everything else goes dark and they're in a crisis situation, look at it in that way, right? You've still got the ability to communicate. And when we meet again in a few weeks' time at the kind of OT cyber event in Aberdeen, we're going to be really kind of looking at a real use case. So what have we seen happen? And there's many of them about, as you know, right now, Tommy, but we'll go through a real kind of example, what happened, and actually kind of how they would have been better to react without a band. But yeah, really much looking forward to that.
Yeah, well, James, it's interesting actually, because we've heard of a multitude of horror stories when these cyber attacks do happen, because everybody assumed it's never going to happen to them, right, as we all know. A very well-known and very well-established car retailer based in Scotland experienced a catastrophic cyber attack some years ago on Christmas Eve. And can you imagine having to resort to nothing better than WhatsApp to keep the business afloat? The sleepless nights these guys had, I've spoken to the CISO, and he says it was one of the worst experiences of his entire life. So no better timing, James, and you're absolutely right. Delighted that you're going to come and extend your partnership with the team here and host one of these executive challenge workshops. For the up-and-coming workshop, James, testing board-level decisions on the degraded communications. And this is the real important thing for me, is for decision makers to realize the challenges they're going to experience if it all goes wrong. So what does that the pressure actually look like, James, in practice?
Yeah.
And why do executives struggle with it, James? Because I think that's the important thing we've got to understand.
Yeah, I think, again, great question, Tommy. It's always interesting, right? So when you look at any kind of attack, doesn't matter whether it's kind of, Russia going into Ukraine or this kind of retailer on Christmas Eve, it's typically done at a time where you're actually least expecting it. Okay, that's the time where you're actually going to be at your most challenged, etc. So again, kind of using like military around this, it's that fog of war, right? You don't really know what's going on. So if you think of it from a normal crisis, whatever that may be, what define normal, executives will typically always have a way of receiving clean, very structured information. information, what's going on, and so you could all come together and actually make a decision about what to do to actually resolve that. In a real cyber attack, that's very different, right? If your communication has gone, your updates are gone. That's all disappeared. You've no longer got that. You don't have that reliable communication. You've got the executives struggling to, just even answer basic questions, right? About what are they, where are they doing it, what's happening, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that is now gone. So what you then see is essentially kind of a lot of people then kind of kicking in those knee-jerk reactions, and they start doing things in a way that they wouldn't normally do, and you get different behavior patterns. And actually what is worse is you actually get leaders kind of doing a decision paralysis. They won't make a decision, they can't do things because they can't get all the information, and then you're actually kind of you're accelerating the problem because you're not reacting to it in the way that you should do. So again, kind of if you think back to Cyber UK, we worked the kind of workshop along with Richard Pearce, who was phenomenal in that event. We should be doing the same again then at the kind of OT kind of cyber event in Aberdeen. And really, what we'll be doing there in a very similar way is it's not a lecture, it's an interactive workshop, right? How do we actually kind of work with the people who are at the event to actually understand what it looks like and put them under the pressure that they should expect to see in that type of kind of in that type of environment, right? But really, if you can think of it now, if you were to go kind of 1 hour kind of Tommy without your internet, what would that do to your
Oh,
life, right? So
James, don't do that. Don't do that to me. The interesting thing, James, and you've just triggered a light bulb moment there. You might have seen it come on, actually. It's okay, panicking and worrying about the important thing, surviving the cyber attack, making sure that your clients are made aware of it, that you've still got communications with everybody in your network. You've got a massive obligation from a compliance and regulatory perspective. Ultimately, you're going to have to report this. Ultimately, you're going to have to understand what went wrong. Was it your network? Were you at fault somewhere? But you've got a compliance obligation if you're a major organization. So when an organization's primary channels go offline during an incident, how do they maintain that legal and regulatory compliance whilst trying to recover? Because, hopefully the dust will settle and then you'll have to do a full post-mortem of what went wrong. So that regulatory and compliance piece, James, how important is that?
amazingly important, and it doesn't stop, right? Once you're actually kind of dealing with this, the regulatory clock is still ticking, and it will
Yeah.
continue to tick all the way through, right? So in reality, the regulators don't care if your email's down, right? They don't care if you don't have that communication channel. They're expecting you to have things in the background to work, right? We're all dealing now with very strict frameworks like NIS2. They're kind of requiring organizations to report these incidents within a very tight window, right? And it's often within 24 to 72 hours. So how do you do that if you can't communicate internally and actually have an update on where you are? So really, you need to be able to have that communication. You need to be able to kind of gather the facts. You need to be able to understand and then disseminate that information out, whether that be to, parties inside your organization or external parties like the regulator. So all of that needs to be done. And as you kind of mentioned, what we do see, unfortunately, is we get a lot of organizations, because they haven't prepared in that way, they'll actually kind of fall into the trap of the consumer messaging application. Right now, that's great. And you've got a little bit of communication going. But what you've also done is actually kind of, you're now potentially exposing corporate information, sensitive corporate information that you shouldn't be doing. You are kind of opening up a real compliance nightmare at this point, right? There's no chain of custody. You haven't got your secure kind of, auditable logs, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of, tell everyone right now, don't go that way. It is a temporary fix, but it's not the right fix. Okay. So really don't do that. So everything you've got to do in terms of being in that dodgy, challenging situation, being under fire, as it were, from those cyber criminals, you have to maintain compliance. So the kind of best way of doing that is to kind of have ready an out-of-band solution that kind of protects your legal position, allows you to communicate securely, and hopefully remain in control and actually come to the shortest possible resolution of the thing of which you're trying to deal with. But the compliance won't go away.
Seriously, it's such a massive, important part of the jigsaw puzzle. Organizations spend multi-millions on network security, on recovery data systems. Well, that's okay after the incident, to consider
Correct.
how you get through that incident really needs to be paid a lot more attention to. So I guess what I'm going to leave with is when a major cyber attack hits, how do we communicate? Don't answer that question, James. That's the question that I'm going to pose in less than 4 weeks' time at the Scottish OT Cyber Summit. We're delighted to have Mattermost there as the principal partner, leading the way forward, sharing your experiences, especially the the real life example that you're going to talk about in the morning, and then the great workshop that you're going to host. James, thank you so much for spending time with me today to give me a better understanding of out-of-band communications. We'll be seeing you at the Scottish OT Cyber Summit in less than 4 weeks in Aberdeen. Thanks for joining me for now, James.
Thank you, Tommy. Appreciate it.